For $6.99, you can buy a small wooden stick at a New Age shop. The box says it will grant you one wish, and the warning on the box says you only get one. Bear Bailey only wanted one wish anyway. He wanted Nikki Freeman to love him. He'd been pining over her for years, too shy to say anything, too scared of rejection to make a move. So one night, out of pure frustration, he snapped the stick and made his wish. And the wish came true. And then it became the worst thing that ever happened to either of them. Obsession, one of the most talked about films of 2026, is being described as a horror movie, a supernatural thriller, a darkly funny nightmare. But underneath all of that, it's something far more important. It's one of the most psychologically precise portraits of male entitlement, limerence, and coercive control ever put on screen. And we need to talk about it. Before we talk about the wish, we need to talk about Bear, because the film opens with a very specific image: Bear obsessively scrolling through Nikki's Instagram, analyzing her likes, reading her comments, studying her life from a screen instead of simply talking to her. The film is making a quiet but deliberate point right from the start. Psychologists have a word for what Bear is experiencing, and it isn't love. It's limerence. Coined by psychologist Dorothy Tenoff in 1979, limerence describes an involuntary state of intense romantic obsession. It feels like love from the inside, but from the outside, and from the psychological research, it looks very different. Limerence is characterized by intrusive, obsessive thinking about another person, the constant mental replaying of interactions, the desperate need for reciprocation, the fantasy of a relationship that exists almost entirely in the mind of the person experiencing it. The crucial distinction between limerence and genuine love is this: limerence is about the person experiencing it. Genuine love is about the other person. Bear doesn't actually know Nikki, not fully, not honestly. He knows the version of Nikki he's constructed in his head, the idealized, perfect, fictional Nikki that his limerence has been building and maintaining for years. And that distinction between the real person and the limerent fantasy is everything. Because when Bear makes his wish, he isn't wishing for the real Nikki to love him. He's wishing for his fantasy to become real. And that is where it all goes wrong. Here's something the film does brilliantly and uncomfortably. Bear is not presented as an obvious villain. He's shy, he's thoughtful. He buys Nikki a necklace to replace one she lost. He listens to her problems. He shows up for her. In the language of internet culture, Bear is the archetypal nice guy. Psychologists who study relational dynamics have identified a specific pattern called nice guy syndrome, a term first popularized by Dr. Robert Glover in his research on male socialization. It describes men who present themselves as kind, supportive, and giving, but who are operating from a hidden transactional framework. The attention, the gifts, the listening, these aren't freely given. They are unconsciously accumulated as a kind of debt. The belief, often unexamined, is that enough niceness eventually earns romantic access. When Bear calls the One Wish Willow helpline to try to alter his wish, not cancel it, alter it, the film reveals something devastating about his character. He doesn't ask how to free Nikki from the curse. He asks if he can modify it so he keeps what he wants while removing the parts that are inconveniencing him. Even knowing Nikki is suffering, his first instinct is to find a way to keep the fantasy. This is the psychological core of entitlement, the belief that desire, effort, or suffering creates an obligation in another person. That wanting something badly enough, or being kind enough, converts another person's autonomy into something that can be negotiated. Bear never asks himself whether Nikki deserves to choose. He only asks how to get what he wants. When Bear snaps the One Wish Willow and makes his wish, something specific and horrifying happens. The One Wish Willow doesn't make Nikki fall in love with Bear. It creates a new entity. Let's call her Freaky Nikki, which is what audiences have taken to calling her, that completely overwrites the real Nikki's personality and autonomy. The real Nikki is still in there, trapped, terrified, desperately trying to claw her way back to the surface. In psychological terms, this is a supernatural metaphor for something very real: coercive control. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior used to take away a person's liberty and freedom, and to strip away their sense of self. It doesn't require physical violence, though it often involves it. It operates through isolation, surveillance, emotional manipulation, and the systematic destruction of a person's identity until they exist only in relation to the controller. The film translates this into horror imagery with extraordinary precision. Freaky Nikki can't be away from Bear without falling apart, literally. She stops eating, stops sleeping, stops being able to function when he isn't present. She kills their mutual friends who represent distractions from her fixation on Bear. She loses all sense of her own needs, her own identity, her own survival instinct, because Bear's wish specified that she love him more than anyone in the world, including herself. That last detail is the most chilling psychological insight in the entire film. Bear didn't wish for Nikki to love him. He wished for Nikki to love him more than she loves herself. And in doing so, even supernaturally, even fictionally, he wished away her personhood entirely. Psychologists call this the annihilation of self that occurs under severe coercive control. The victim's internal world is so thoroughly colonized by the relationship that they lose the ability to exist independently. The One Wish Willow didn't create love. It created a prison. The most uncomfortable scene in Obsession, and reviewers across the board have noted this, isn't the violence. It's the morning after Bear's wish comes true, when Nikki's behavior has already become clearly wrong, and Bear continues anyway. Bear knows something is wrong with Nikki. Her behavior is erratic. She isn't herself. He has a reasonable suspicion his wish may have actually worked, and he still chooses to continue the relationship, physically and romantically, because what he's getting from it is what he wanted. This is the film's most pointed psychological and moral statement. Consent in psychology and ethics isn't simply the absence of the word no. Genuine consent requires full information, freedom from coercion, and the capacity to make an autonomous choice. Nikki under the Wish has none of these things. Her yes is not her own. It belongs to the entity the One Wish Willow created. The real Nikki, the one breaking through the surface in moments of horrifying clarity, is screaming. The film asks us to hold two things simultaneously. Bear is not a monster in the conventional sense. He is recognizable, ordinary, someone most of us might know. His desire for connection is human and understandable. And what he does with that desire, how he pursues it, how he responds when he gets it, how he prioritizes his fantasy over another person's reality, is a precise portrait of how ordinary entitlement creates extraordinary harm. The supernatural element of obsession is a narrative device, but the psychology it's illuminating is real and present in relationships everywhere, minus the novelty toy. The most heartbreaking psychological thread in the film belongs to the real Nikki, the one trapped inside her own body watching someone else wear her face. Psychologists who work with survivors of coercive control and severe trauma describe a phenomenon called identity erosion, the gradual or sudden loss of a person's sense of self under conditions of extreme psychological pressure. In severe cases, the person stops knowing who they are outside the relationship. Their preferences, values, memories, and personality become inaccessible. They exist only as a reflection of the controller's desires. The film gives this clinical concept a face. The real Nikki breaks through the surface at her most desperate moments in a disturbing poem she reads at a party that reveals the horror of what's happening inside her. In a moment of self-harm that is really an act of communication, a desperate attempt to signal to Bear that something is catastrophically wrong. And in her most devastating moment of clarity, when she asks Bear to end her life rather than let her continue living trapped inside herself. That request, and Bear's inability to truly hear it because it threatens what he has, is the moral center of the entire film. Nikki's suffering is legible. It is visible. Bear can see it. And he keeps choosing himself anyway. Research on coercive control consistently shows that the most common response from controlling partners when confronted with the harm they're causing is minimization, reframing the victim's distress as temporary, manageable, or separate from their own behavior. Bear does this throughout the film. He tells himself he'll fix it. He tells himself she'll be okay. He finds reasons to delay addressing her suffering because addressing it would mean losing what he has. That is not love. Psychologists have a much more precise name for it. What does the psychology of obsession actually tell us? It tells us that the most dangerous relationships aren't the ones that begin with obvious cruelty. They're the ones that begin with someone who genuinely believes they're being loving, who has constructed such a complete and convincing internal justification for what they want that they've stopped being able to see the other person as fully real. Bear Bailey is not a cartoon villain. He's a recognizable human being whose ordinary needs for connection, for belonging, for love were never examined or challenged until they destroyed everyone around him. The One Wish Willow is fictional, but the psychology it represents is not. Limerence, entitlement, the transactional logic of the nice guy, the prioritization of fantasy over reality, the continuation of something harmful because what you're getting from it feels like what you need. These things exist in real relationships without any supernatural intervention at all. Obsession is a horror movie, but its real horror isn't the supernatural, it's the recognition. Next time we turn the lens on one of cinema's most purely calculating characters, Amy Dunn from Gone Girl. If Bear represents entitlement in its most ordinary form, Amy represents something far more deliberate, far more controlled, and far more psychologically sophisticated. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.